Hey noble ones, welcome back to my channel. This is the Metatron speaking, and today we are talking about jobs, but not just any job. We're talking about medieval jobs, and you thought that you have a difficult job? Get ready. Job number 1, galley rower. Now, despite the common belief that rowers on medieval galleys were slaves, criminals or prisoners, which is most likely coming from sort of the Renaissance period, until the mid-16th century, the crews of rowers on warships sailing the Mediterranean were predominantly free men, called bonevoglie in the maritime republics and Italian powers, and buenas aboyas in Spain. Initially, the bonevoglie were young volunteers between 18 and 40 years old, but as it was an incredibly tiring, burdensome and dangerous job, which also required staying at sea for long periods, their recruitments became increasingly complex. In Venice, for example, when volunteers began to run short, they started recruiting rowers called zontaroli, citizens conscripted by drawing lots among those who were members of the trade guilds or corporations. Now, even though this sort of worked at first when it comes to like covering the demand that we had for, all of these ships that needed to be manned, the zontaroli actually didn't work very well because these were mostly people that, being just randomly selected, they had zero experience when it comes to life at sea, and so therefore didn't really do a great job. Also, another thing that happened, which shouldn't really surprise you if you're familiar with how, for example, medieval knights were recruited, is that sometimes guilds that didn't want to give up on their own workforce, they agreed to instead pay a tax whenever some of their people were going to be randomly selected to become zontaroli, so once again rowers for ships. And the reason why I say this should sound familiar, because it's how some medieval knights, particularly nobles, managed to avoid to go and serve their king annually during campaigns. They would just pay a tax so that they wouldn't have to do that. And then the tax was used by the king to pay for mercenaries instead. Now, due to the fact that specifically in Venice, this idea of I'll just pay the tax became very popular because of course the guilds were very profitable at this time, so they absolutely had the money and it was in fact financially advantageous to them to just pay the freaking tax and don't lose the workforce, which makes us more money in the long run. What the Venetian republics resorted to was to instead starting hiring free volunteers again, not only from Venice but also from the Dalmatian coasts. In any case, a general increase in the average standard of living made it increasingly difficult to find personnel willing to be hired for rowing, and those responsible for the Mediterranean navies began to employ another expedient. Check this one out because it's insane. Recruiters who needed to get rowers for their ships decided to start visiting all of these taverns and gambling houses in port cities. Now, what they would do, they would examine the situation, and whenever someone was like losing or were in need of loan, or people who were absolutely addicted to both either gambling or alcohol, well, they would give them a loan. But these would be written down with very unfair contracts, but since these people were mostly desperate, they would accept it. But then, since the span of time that they were given to actually finally have the money and give it back, of course, would be too short on purpose, and then they didn't have the money, then these contracts would have a little clause which would say, if you can't pay my money back, well, then you have to pay it by working on the ships as a rower or a bonavoglia. Smart bastards. According to Guglielmotti, in the 19th century in southern Italy, the memory of these activities was still indirectly present, though the idiomatic expression in response to those who required an excessive economic commitment, "Do you then want me to have to sell myself to the Venetian?" still remains. Bartolomeo Crescenzio writes in 1607 that the situation was getting so bad when it comes to this activity and this specific manner of recruiting rowers for ships that even the papal navy was having basically now just a bunch of vagabonds that, due to hunger or gambling, were forced to row for the ships. And he also tells us that the best instead at doing this, so at rowing, would be either the Spaniards or the Neapolitans. The increasingly overbearing eruption of piracy organized by the Ottoman Turks onto the Mediterranean scene led to an ever-growing demand for personnel on the galleys, which in the long run the bonevoglie could no longer satisfy due to the aforementioned disbanding of free men for an occupation perceived, in many respects and rightly so, as too burdensome and dangerous. Before the definitive decline of rowing ships in favor of sailing ships, conventionally placed in the early 1700s, the rowers of the great European war fleets were formed exclusively of criminals and Turkish and Moorish prisoners of war. I'm sure you already feel much better about your current job, but things are gonna get Much worse. If you thought that the job of a rower was bad, wait until we talk about the raker, or raker, however you want to read it. I'm gonna say raker. I'm Italian, shut up. Raker is a term that appears in 14th century England to indicate a person whose job was to dean cesspits. Yeah, you got it right. Exactly what you thought. They're cleaning toilets. The absence of a functioning sewage system made it necessary to periodically empty the cesspits to avoid the onset of diseases, and in the mid-14th century at least one raker was assigned to each district of London who, after emptying the pits, was responsible of disposing of the excrement in the Thames or outside the city perimeter. Now, apart from the fact that we of course go, ew, that's gross, but apart from the gross factor, this was actually a dangerous job for two reasons. Reason number one, diseases. I mean, you could contract something really bad, and it's already bad in itself, but then we are in the 14th century, so good luck with medicine. They did have some, but I mean, yeah, imagine if you get a cut and then you're cleaning, oh my gosh. But there is the second reason. These cesspits were very seldomly maintained, which means that the thing could fall on you, you could break a piece, you could really injure yourself, because basically there was no safety. In London's coroner rolls of 1326, the death of a certain Richard the Raker is reported, who, while using the latrine he was working on, had fallen into the cesspit below following the breaking of the floorboards, ending up drowning in the excrement. Oh my gosh. Can we take a moment? Someone drowned in the... oh my gosh. Poor guy. I'm never gonna complain about my job as a YouTuber ever again. Ever. Another term by which the raker's trade was known was gang firmer or gong farmer. Gaung or gong is an old English word that indicates the latrine and by extension excrement. The term was formed through several logical association steps deriving from the Germanic gang, gate or walk, the same route as the English to go. Gong was the place where one went to do someone's business. With that being said, sorry, I'm off to the gong. I'll see you in a minute. What a beautiful gong I have! Firmer, although identical to the term for farmer, has a completely different origin. The French fermeur, which was adopted into English and then transformed into farmer, derives from the Latin firmarius, tenant, in the sense of person to whom a plot of land has been assigned. However, the word firmer of gong firmer, on the other hand, derives from the Germanic feimer, from fey, to clean. So basically, he who cleans the latrine. Good luck with that. Since it was a very unsanitary and horrible activity really, the job of the raker was mostly done at night, hence the use of calling the rakers also nightmen. So you're basically Batman. That's medieval Batman, or Batman. Wait, that was actually good. If you're enjoying this video so far, please take a moment to check out my Patreon page. With as little as a $5 support, you can help us ensure that we can continue to produce high quality and high researched content. And at the same time, you get access to polls, extra videos, unlisted streams, and much more. Thank you so much. Now, the next job after these two is actually much better, and it's that of the alewife. Yep, that's what you want. A medieval alewife. In 13th century England, legislative documents regulating the beer trade present terms with exclusively feminine endings to define the brewer, such as pandosatrix. In the entry dedicated to the city of Hereford in the Domesday Book, there is also a reference to the tax to be paid by anyone whose wife produced beer. And this is interesting because it kind of implies the fact that it was a little bit of a woman's job to brew beer. Is that the case? Let's dive. The evolution that had led women to deal with beer fermentation probably stemmed from the fact that it could be a non-totalizing, non-specialized activity easily performed at home along with other household chores, originally carried out to satisfy only the needs of one's own family. Any excess beer production had led some enterprising women to propose its occasional sale, giving rise to a trade that had turned into an additional source of income for the household economy. The activity of alewives seems to have been closely linked to its occasional and amateur character, and the decline of this craft appears to be linked to the professionalization of the beer market.
See?
Hello.
Are you alright?
Oh, yeah. What are you doing?
Nothing?
Brewing beer, are you?
Yes.
Oh, good. How's the beer brewing going?
I think it's going pretty well. It's in a barrel.
Oh, that's nice. How many barrels do you think we're going to sell tonight?
40,000.
Splendid. Thank you so much.
Of course.
Bye.
Bye.
Oh my gosh, I love my wife. That was not prepared. Talking about playing along. The Black Death from 1346 to 1353 had dominated Europe, including England, but beyond being an epidemic tragedy, precisely because it had reduced the population in such a short time, it had indirectly caused an increase in per capita wealth, consequently increasing living standards and consumption of the population. In other words, that could be considered to be the Black Death's silver lining. That sounds pretty bad still. The Yersinia pestis bacterium silver lining. Okay, never mind. It was still horrible. In addition to meat consumption, which increased at the expense of bread consumption, beer consumption also began to rise, penalizing that of cheaper beverages such as cider, and in addition to being perceived as a food, beer began to be consumed also as a recreational product. Yeah, some people in medieval England thought the beer was food, so next time someone asks, hey, what did you do yesterday night? You just say, oh, I just had a large meal, leave it at that. If they find out, you can just say, hey, medieval, I meant it in the medieval way, just had a large meal. The beer-related market thus began to diversify and differentiate, with production and distribution gradually separating into increasingly distinct branches, and in conclusion there was a transformation of brewing from a home-based, low-profit by industry into a brewhouse-based, high-profit occupation. If you're enjoying this video so far, please take a moment to check out my Patreon page. With as little as a $5 support, you can help us ensure that we can continue to produce high quality and high researched content. And at the same time, you get access to polls, extra videos, unlisted streams, and much more. Thank you so much. Things change in the 16th century when, because of the fact that now brewing beer wasn't an exclusive feminine thing or woman thing to do as it was before, it was now becoming something that was done, at a high production level by industries. It also became stigmatized, and in fact the few remaining alewives started to be ridiculed. This is also when beer stops being considered a food by people and is starting to be considered a drink, and sometimes even an intoxicating one. All of this leading to 1540 in Chester, where the sale of beer to women between 14 and 40-year-old, so the age range in which they were considered desirable, was prohibited. Okay, so far we talked about a really hard job, we talked about a horrible job, we talked about, that's an interesting one, we'll be a wife, alright, that's nice. Let's talk about the town crier. Oh, I bet so many people in our day and age are gonna excel at this one. Crybabies. Okay, I'm joking. It doesn't have to do with crying. Do you know when in medieval films and sometimes in games you've got the people that stand in the plaza or the main square, they've got all of the new things that the king, for example, wants you to know, and they go, hear ye, hear ye. That's what we're talking about. You better have a good voice. And they were also Batman. You'll see what I mean in a second. The town crier is an institutional figure that has its origin in various ancient world cultures, but our imagination certainly links it, but history also links it to the medieval period, and 2024. Over the centuries, various figures have had the task of informing the population of a settlement in the shortest possible time of important news, and especially of the deliberation of the leaders of society. In the medieval context, very often the town crier was an officer of the city guard whose task was not limited to loudly proclaiming deliberations and news, but also patrolling the streets at night, making them safe, acting as a deterrent and vigilante, ensuring that the curfew, if there was one, was respected. Often the figure was equipped with a bell useful for attracting attention, and for this reason, in addition to town crier, it was also called the bellman. Bellman, not billman. Billman is the guy with the bill. Yeah, bellman. In the Anglo-Saxon world, the figure of the town crier was probably introduced following the Norman conquest. The first depiction of town criers with bells is on the Bayeux tapestry, represented while accompanying the coffin of Edward the Confessor, and we know that following the Battle of Hastings, William the Conqueror sent town criers to the main centres of England to announce his victory to the population. Another clue to the Franco-Norman origin of the English town crier is his traditional cry, "Oyez," the plural imperative of the Franco-Norman "Oyez," from the French ouïr, to listen, to hear. Let's talk now about the water carrier. During the Middle Ages, drawing from wells and drinking water springs in small villages was framed among the domestic activities performed by women or children. But in the larger centres of the late Middle Ages, the increasing population density, together with the arrangement of the sources used for supply, led to the birth of the trade of a water carrier, whose job was to bring water from the nearest source, be it an artificial conduit, a cistern, or a river, to the homes of private individuals. Whenever we read the medieval sources, we see that the job of the water carrier is in fact ubiquitous. It's everywhere from the west to the east, but it's different in the way they carry the water. Sometimes they're described as carrying like a big jar made of terracotta, for example, and they would be carrying them on their backs. But another type, which I know you have seen somewhere in the old cartoons or games, is having 2 buckets of water connected with a yoke on their shoulders. Yes, they existed. The job of water carrier could be riskier than one might think, because several factors could make it very difficult to adequately meet customer demand. The progressive pollution of riverbanks, which often saw the indiscriminate dumping of organic waste, could make it impossible to supply directly from there. And in centers near river mouths, sometimes the occurrence of particularly high tides made the water salty. Yeah, mine is not salty. Good water carrier. This of course could become even more problematic with times of drought, when water tended to be scarce in cisterns and artificial conduits. All of this led to disputes between carriers, which could even turn into violent clashes, and in 1300s London, edicts were issued to expressly prohibit the use of weapons by the cobs, the London water carriers, to gain the first places at the drinking water dispensers. Can you imagine that? Today we are thinking of like gangs fighting over territory. In the medieval period in London, they were having like water carriers. You don't fuck with a water carrier. In London, however, the cobs not only had to watch out for mutual competition, but also for impromptu actions by the local underworld. For example, we know that in 1343, some residents of one of the main neighborhoods near the Thames closed its streets, imposing a toll on anyone who went to the river to draw water. Just like in the games. I've seen it, whether it be Skyrim, Oblivion, Dragon Age Origins. The Muppet that stands in the, like he owns the place, and he's like, no, you can't pass here, you need to give me 10 gold, and then he gets killed because you're like super... Same thing. But even though in these fictional games, at least they get killed by like a super demigod adventurer, a wizard, magic user, whatever. Here they got killed. In reality, they got killed by water carriers. So I mean, scribe or amanuenses. The amanuenses was the one who, before the invention and spread of printing, copied manuscripts for their preservation for religious institution or in the service of private individuals or for sale to the public. The term amanuensis derives from the Latin servus a manu, slave who uses the hand. Other terms that indicate the profession are cartolaio or scrivano. Between the 6th to the 12th century, the job of a amanuensis or a scribe was exclusively the domain of churches, but most commonly convents and monasteries. Sometimes also ecclesiastical schools. It was the prerogative of monks and priests, after all, one of the few social classes that mastered reading and writing at the time. Religious texts were more frequently transcribed by the amanuensis in a room intended for this activity, the scriptorium, where among other things they each copied a different manuscript. The amanuenses were divided into different specializations. The scriptor was the one who wrote. The corrector was the one that checked that there were no errors. Then you have the miniator, who decorated the pages and codex and illustrated them with miniatures. And by the way, the reason why we call them miniatures is because it comes from the word minium in Latin, which describes the red color that was the characteristic of the initial letters of each chapter. Take that one as a fun fact. With the 13th century, alongside the monastic schools, the industry of professional writers developed, those more correctly defined as scribes or scrivani. These are laymen, sometimes gathered in guilds, who mainly deal with copying profane text. As it can be expected, the profession of scribe disappeared with the advent of movable type printing. Okay, noble ones, well, I hope that you enjoyed this video about jobs. Which one of these jobs to you is the worst one? Of course, is the raker, but which one is the worst one you think, and which one is instead the one that you would do if you really had to choose one job from this list of medieval jobs? I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you very much for watching. If you're not a member of this community, become a noble one. Subscribe to my channel for more content from the Metatron, and remember, the Metatron has spread his wings. Goodbye.